Sitting down, please.
Good evening. Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining us for these. There's a bit of noise down the back there. Adam? Yes, you're interrupting the proceedings. I'd like to welcome everybody to the new fellow presentations. And although we like to keep a certain amount of informality in this session, it is, please, helpful if you can give your full attention to the new fellows that we welcome tonight. For those of you who don't know me, I'm Jane Hall, and I'm the immediate past president of the Academy. And I can say that one of the important things we do as an Academy is celebrate achievements in the social sciences, and welcoming our new fellows is very, very much a tangible demonstration of celebrating the achievements of the social sciences. I would like to start with an acknowledgement of country. I would like to pay my respects to the traditional owners of the land on which we meet, who are the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And of course, we all pay our respects to elders, past, present, and emerging. So each year, the Academy of Social Sciences elects the most distinguished social sciences in Australia as fellows. And if you've been through the process, you know it's quite a process, it's very rigorous, and nothing is guaranteed. So those of you who are new fellows have been really judged by your peers as outstanding scholars and contributors to the social sciences. You're joining the ranks of over 700 of Australia's leading researchers and professionals across the social science disciplines. This event will provide an opportunity to welcome 2020 new fellows and recognise their outstanding contributions. This evening, each fellow will have 3 minutes to present their work so that we get to know them better. And indeed, we've got a number of fellows who'll be presenting over Zoom. My speaking notes say, speak about the value of the Academy and what it can mean to new fellows. For me, the best part of the Academy has been the interest and the wide range of interests and expertise to which it opens you, the connections that it gives you, the fascinating involvement of senior fellows. I think many of us can relate stories of meeting people whose textbooks we read as undergraduates, and that's a fantastic experience. It's also fabulous to see new fellows coming through, to see the work that's being done, and to see how what many of us have worked for over many, many years is being continued with a great sense of vision and a great sense of commitment to academic and scholarly values. I think at that point the right thing to do is to move to the overview of the presentation of new fellows, which is going to be a short video.
Hi, I'm Tom Calma. I'm Kulnarrikan on my mother's side, Iwija on my father's side. I come from Darwin, just outside of Darwin, but I live in Canberra on Ngunnawal country now. From being the Chancellor of the University of Canberra to an academic at University of Sydney, I chair the Living First Language platform, which is about reviving and resurrecting Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander languages, to the Australian Literacy and Numeracy Foundation, where we work at early years education.
I'm a scholar and a student of international relations and international security,
particularly as they pertain to East Asia, or what we used to think of as the Asia Pacific. I am driven by rage at how often and how much we get things wrong when we try to understand and analyze international relations and security in East Asia.
Because education, as I say, is the vaccine to poverty. So the more people we can get educated, the more jobs they'll get, and their health will improve. And so education is a core, and all these other things have an influence.
Secondly, I'm motivated by the unique opportunities that are afforded to a scholar such as myself to inform and hopefully to not so much educate, but to help shape and reshape how thinkers, and scholars and movers and shakers of tomorrow think about the critical issues that affect security in our age. To be elected to the Academy is obviously a huge honor, and I am appropriately honored and very, very grateful to my peers for this recognition. So I'm very grateful, very honored, and even more motivated to do better.
Look, to be accepted as a Fellow of the Academy is a real honour and a privilege, and it's something that I hadn't anticipated. Having it as an Academy and doing it collectively has much more impact than doing it as an individual. So that's what the Academy brings, and I really look forward to be able to working with peers over the coming years.
Thank you. So let me just tell you about the agenda. We have 26 fellows presenting to us this evening. We'll have 12 presentations, then a short break, and 14 to come after the second service of canapes. In the meantime, please, if you wish to get up and help yourself to more drinks, please do so, but do it quietly. Each new fellow will have 3 minutes to present. There are bells and buzzers and whistles, so it's going to be pretty strict. So in the sense of keeping to the fairly tight time frame that we have, I'm going to allow the fellows to introduce their work themselves, and I will just invite them up by name. So let us start, and our first new fellow is Professor Rachel Ankeny. Rachel, welcome.
Thanks, Jane. Okay, so what do the following 7 things have in common? Echidnas, stem cells, migrant hostiles, nematode worms, medical case reports, genetically modified crops, and halal snack packs. Anybody? Okay, the answer is that I've studied all of these things in my research. That might make me completely eclectic in my scholarly leanings, but what I think is critical is that I see these things as things that are good to think with. And in general, my research, I use everyday and scientific objects like these to explore knowledge-making and experiential practices. I investigate underlying norms and values associated with these sorts of objects in their rich social, cultural, political, and historical contexts, and in the way in which they're produced, used, or consumed. All these things share other qualities. They simultaneously inhabit multiple types of spaces and are often used as centerpieces of arguments that proceed in unpredictable and unexpected ways. Hence, I rely heavily on empirical approaches to explore ethical, social, policy questions at the intersection of various domains, particularly using qualitative approaches that are open-ended. My methods require rejection of presumptions and assumptions, and they promote the inclusion of views from diverse publics in policy debates. Finally, the other thing that they have in common is that they share the quality of being proxies or models for concepts, norms, and values because they have associations that go far beyond the objects themselves. For instance, consider halal food. The Food Values Research Group at the University of Adelaide, which I founded, has documented that food choices often aren't about the food. They serve as proxies for values relating to visions of the good life. Some of these are fairly benign associations, such as considering local food to be anything that you buy local, but other associations are more problematic. For example, discussions about halal food revealed xenophobic and often racist responses, disguised as moral concerns about animal welfare. Similarly, my studies of biological research practices explore why certain organisms are featured or favored as the best tools to use to understand the natural world. These trends are deeply tied to history. Contemporary reliance on worms, mice, and fruit flies is grounded not just in the biological details about these organisms, but the technologies, the funding imperatives, the shared practices, and the research goals in scientific communities. In turn, what we know about them and ourselves has been greatly shaped by these contingent factors. Finally, whether genetic modification of crops is thought to be beneficial or problematic by various publics is a very complex matter. It's only loosely related to the science of GM and much more closely linked to views about what makes good food. My research has underscored the importance of founding our understandings of values and norms in empirical approaches. Situated epistemology, grounded in the rich detail of human practices, is essential if we want to better understand people's values and norms and generate policy that is justified and legitimate. Look around you for neglected objects and use them to think with. You won't be disappointed. Thanks.
Thanks, Rachel. And congratulations. I'd like to invite Professor Sascha Becker to the stage.
Hi, I'm Sascha Becker. I'm an economist doing empirical work on economic history, labor economics, and political economy. While I work mostly with economists, I also love to work with people across disciplines. So I've written papers with historians and sociologists, and I would just like to give you two examples of my recent work. So in one paper with fellow Academy Fellow, Pauline Grosjean, I've looked into a test of the uprootedness hypothesis. What is that? The uprootedness hypothesis claims that people who are forced to leave behind their home as a result of wars or natural disasters would, as a result of that loss of all their physical possessions, now redirect their investment towards things that no one can take away from you, which is education. So what we see is in the context of post-World War II Poland, where the border shifted by 300 kilometers because Poland lost its eastern part to the Soviet Union and gained territory that Germany had to give away. The people in the east of Poland had to resettle in the rest of Poland, either in central Poland, Warsaw and other areas, or in the formerly German territories. And what we find is that, indeed, those people who were forced to migrate, different from other Polish people, are in the next generation and the subsequent generation more educated than any other Polish group. And that is interesting insofar as before World War II, people in these eastern territories of Poland were less educated than the rest of Polish people. So we are comparing forced migrants to stayers or to people who voluntarily migrated and we compare them in the same cities, and the only thing that differs between them is some have a family history of forced displacement, others don't. That's one piece of work. Then I also love working on religion and culture. And one of the papers I did some time ago is on the Protestant Reformation and how it spread in the German lands. And this is work with sociologists. And what we do there is we have collected the universe of Martin Luther's letters that he wrote to people across Germany before he became a celebrity. So these are early links he has. On top, we know where he traveled, again, before he became a celebrity. And we know the students who studied in Wittenberg, the town where he was a professor, before he became a celebrity. Now, once he becomes a celebrity, nailing the 95 theses on a church door in Wittenberg and trying to bring down the Catholic Church, these early links he can now use to lobby for his cause. And we show that these early links indeed predict the adoption of the Reformation in those cities where he had connections.
And congratulations to Sascha. I'd like to now invite Professor Monica Cuskelly to the stage.
The lives of people with intellectual disability have changed enormously in the time that I've been working in the field. As an example, when I was first, in the year that I was employed in education in Queensland, the government agreed to provide education for all children, irrespective of their level of ability. Up until that time, some children had been considered to be ineducable and so were unable to go to school in the state system. That change and other social changes that have come along with that have made the lives of people with intellectual disability and developmental disability much wider and richer than they were. And part of my research has been to try and understand the trajectories of development, primarily cognitive development and in many of its forms, and the influences on those as people age. So the social changes have contributed enormously and made it clear that there are a number of ways in which people with intellectual disability can be influenced positively for their intellectual development. So I'm just going to talk briefly about my two current foci of research, one of which is following on in that vein. I'm looking at the impact that siblings have on the development of children with developmental disorder, in this case, autism spectrum disorder. So I'm hoping that this research will reveal both mechanisms of change and also the areas of development that are most open to change, because these will then help us to develop better, more effective interventions for children with this level of difficulty. I should just say I'm not advocating, and I will not be advocating in the future, I shouldn't imagine, that we think of siblings as agents of change within families, because I think that has some likely negative consequences that would be unwise for us to pursue. My second area of current interest is in the social connections and loneliness in people with intellectual disability. We all know that loneliness is a problem in our society, and those with intellectual disability are more vulnerable to loneliness than almost every other group in our society. So the current work is focused on measurement, first of loneliness, but then also looking at the social connections, the day-to-day interactions or lack thereof, the nature of those interactions, and their relationship to loneliness and the experience of social connection. Thank you.
Thank you, Monica. Congratulations. Professor Kim Dovey, please.
Well, thank you very much. I want to thank all of those of you who have elected me to this honourable club. And I think I'm the first from the research fields of architecture and urban design, so I'm especially grateful for you to opening the door a little wider, maybe. My research interests have been on questions of place and power, both rather problematic concepts. I'm fascinated by the many interconnections between spatiality and sociality, by the ways that rooms, buildings, neighbourhoods and cities frame our lives in the best and the worst of ways, particularly the ways power hides in place. I've never seen this work fitting neatly into the social sciences, but neither does it fit into the humanities, the arts or the physical sciences. It's also design research in the sense that I investigate places in terms of their capacities for change. At the architectural scale, I've studied schools as learning environments geared to student-centred pedagogies, not simply a choice between open and closed plans, but a challenge of designing for multiple modes of learning. At the more urban scale, I've been engaged in a broad range of questions, such as what's wrong with tall buildings, shopping malls, gated enclaves? What do we mean by public space, or walkability, or density? How can we transform car-dependent cities and move beyond the mere rhetoric of healthy cities, equitable cities, creative, smart, or green cities? My recent work has been on trying to understand informal urbanism in global south cities, with a focus on informal settlements. While widely regarded as slums to be demolished and replaced, here the challenge is to understand informal settlement as a mode of production, as a form of urban design and planning that currently produces affordable housing for up to 20% of the global population. My research approach might be called assemblage thinking, or resilience thinking, or perhaps capacity thinking. As you may have gathered, this work is not just interdisciplinary, but perhaps a bit homeless, which is ironic because my most cited paper is an essay which was called Home and Homelessness, which was written as a PhD student in 1985, which is another way of saying that I may be getting a bit old to go clubbing, but I'm very happy to be welcomed into this one. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kim. And whilst you may be the first architect and urban planner, I think you've very neatly encapsulated why it's so relevant to us, the Academy of the Social Sciences, who are all about building a better society. My pleasure now to welcome Professor Emeritus Geoff Gallop to the stage. Thanks.
Thank you very much to the Academy for giving me the privilege of being part of your work, and I hope I can contribute over the years. I've worked it out that I've been 50-50 in my career, 50% politics, 50% academia. And it's always interested me what is the relationship between those two things. And there's no doubt that in my time, certainly in politics and academia, I've had a strongly held view that each should inform the other in terms of the work that's being done. But the issue that's really, I suppose, provided a focus for me, whether I've been dealing with public administration, whether I've been dealing with democratic reform, is this issue of democracy. And I know it's a subject of the seminar over the last few days. How can we make our democratic system, how can we give it more authority and more effectiveness as a major institution in our society? And what I've learnt, I guess, over the years is that the thirst for power and influence amongst the practitioners, the politicians, can never be underestimated. The most wonderful time in a cabinet is when you put up all of the nominations for various positions. All the members love talking about that. That person shouldn't be in, that one should be in, etc. Power. Very powerful factor in politics. It's an end as well as a means to an end. And then along comes the political scientists over centuries since democracy has started to be a model of governance, that informs us on the ways and means that we can regulate this hunger for power such that the public interest is protected and promoted. And of course that means a range of checks and balances. And in some way political science is the philosophy of checks and balances, how we can make the system work such that those who are seeking the power in the political realm do it in a way and are subject to regulation in a way that what comes out at the other end is the public interest. It follows that if we're to have a good system, I think the political scientists need to have some power within the system, some credibility in the system, some authority in the system, so that it can get that balance right in terms of its deliberations. Now, what we've seen, of course, as a result of a lot of academic work that's filtered into the political system, improvements in the way we conduct our democracy, of fair and free elections, the creation of a whole lot of independent accountability agencies here in Australia, just one the other day with the Corruption Commission, auditors, freedom of information, you name it. All of these institutions are now part of the system of democracy. So the system we've got is based upon the elections and based on the independent agency, accountability agencies. And it's interesting to observe that a lot of the academic discussion about our system now and the issues that it faces focuses on elections and on accountability agencies. And to me, that's been a major subject of inquiry in recent times, and I'm now moving towards thinking that if we're really to deal with this issue, we need to get into the world that is deliberative democracy. It's a world that I inhabited as Premier of Western Australia in terms of some major issues, and I'm very keen to have a dialogue on that within the Academy. Thank you very much, Jane.
Welcome, Geoff, and congratulations. We now move to a remote presentation to welcome Professor Peng B. And Peng, you join us remotely. Welcome.
Thank you. Climate changing has and will continue to have negative impacts on Australians' health and well-being. So in the past decades, we saw dengue fever outbreak every couple of years in Far North Queensland. We saw close association between high temperatures and rotavirus infections. We saw increased salmonella infections in hot days, and very recently, we saw Japanese encephalitis cases among the forest workers during New South Wales flooding. So in addition to infectious diseases, we also found climate changing with increased intensity and duration of hot days also have negative impacts for chronic diseases such as cardiovascular, renal, mental health diseases. In 2009 heatwave in Adelaide, for example, we saw the direct hospital admissions increase 14 times high. Ambulance calls out increased about 16%. In Victoria, also in 2009, a 3-day heatwave caused additional 374 deaths. Our study found old people, migrant community, and outdoor workers are particularly vulnerable. So in 2019, Australia construction workers lost almost 77 working hours during extreme heat, which is double for the average of last 10 years. We also found extreme heat caused substantial work-related injuries and illness in Australia. So what we should do? Of course, we need to work together to reduce emission of greenhouse gases. We can use green energy, we can use public transportation. On the other hand, I think we need also to work out how can we improve climate changing adaptations. Working closely with South Australia government, we have implemented the South Australia extreme heat and health warning system. The evaluation found it can reduce both population mobility and associated healthcare costs. In addition to such generic adaptation strategies, it's also important to develop a tailored preventive measurements for the most vulnerable populations. So for example, we could ask our family members and neighborhoods to better look after our senior citizens during the hot days. We could encourage our GPs to better communicate with chronic disease patients. We could also work together to find a feasible code of practice for outdoor workers during the extreme hot days. So climate change is happening, so let's work together to take it. Also, I would thank you very much for this opportunity to talk to you. Thank you.
Welcome and congratulations on your election. Now, a second remote presentation from Professor Kathy Bowrey.
Good evening. I'd like to acknowledge that I'm speaking to you from the lands of the Gundungurra and Darrin people from the Blue Mountains in Sydney. I research cultural, legal and policy frameworks that affect the production and circulation of knowledge and culture. I'm interested in whose stories and whose knowledge gets heard with what types of interventions and disruptions. But I'm also very mindful that commodification of all knowledge tends to impact on the industries and the communities within the information ecosystem. My work is always interdisciplinary and largely historical. I began getting into the subject by doing a deep dive into the origins of intellectual property laws in the first place, and then moved on to consider business archival records and other empirical methods to try and understand what is actually going on in decision-making about cultural production and the implications of those types of deals. I'm particularly interested in questions of agency, the agency of First Nations as knowledge holders, but also the creators of Australian cultural expressions more generally. And of late, I've been researching decision-making about publication by academic researchers and tracking the collective impact of the individual decisions that we all make in our careers as authors and how that affects our universities. I just want to share two small observations from that research, and I'm very grateful to the ARC for funding that with a discovery project. My colleagues and I conducted a range of interviews with the NHMRC, ARC, senior management and researchers across multiple institutions and with researchers from various disciplines. Also interviewed the chief scientist who's interested in some of these issues. And we looked at an overview of cross-institutional approaches to policies and how researchers deal with what is often quite conflicting policy demands. We also were concerned about the impact of the policies in this sector on our libraries. One of the first things we found was that the policies about how knowledge is communicated and on the terms of that communication, including things like open access mandates, is being developed by people who actually have very limited understanding of the publishing industry. It's a multinational global industry and requires quite a sophisticated approach. They also have pretty modest understanding of copyright. There's almost no reference to our roles as actual researchers and our experience of these policies and practices that impact on its formulation. Australian policy reform is developing, but it's not evidence-led and it's not very well followed by overseas practice, and we're now quite a way behind the UK and the EU. The second area relates to Indigenous research. The national policy frameworks are now considered to be quite good, but our researchers report that they don't actually have any understanding about, on a day-to-day basis, how they're supposed to be implementing them in their negotiations with Indigenous collaborators. And these are two areas that I'd be really interested in talking to members of the Academy more and trying to impact on these situations. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathy. Welcome and congratulations on your election. Another new fellow joining us by Zoom, please welcome Professor Henry Brodaty.
Oh, sorry. Imagine you're in your 70s, worried about becoming more forgetful. Should you be worried? Almost 500,000 people in Australia have dementia. We spend 1% of our GDP on this. Projections for the prevalence and cost are set to double by mid-century. You go to see your GP and you ask, can you prevent this? We know that there are modifiable risk factors that account for 40% of the population attributable risk for dementia. A randomised controlled trial I led, looking at physical activity, brain training, nutrition, and depression anxiety treatment, all online, has shown we can delay cognitive decline with ageing. I've also been particularly focused on the link between social and cognitive health. People who are less socially connected, don't have a confidant, are lonelier, have a higher rate of dementia at follow-up. We've been analysing large databases confirming these findings, and also the link between poor social health and mortality. But suppose you went to your GP. Your GP diagnosed early dementia. What happens is nothing much is offered. Rehab is offered after a stroke, but not after a diagnosis. I've been leading a 5-country study to improve diagnostic communication, post-diagnostic care, and rehabilitation. We are now collaborating with government, Dementia Australia, to try and influence public opinion and healthcare workers through social media on living positively with dementia. It's possible. There's evidence for it. Dementia presents a microcosm of many issues affecting healthcare: the social system, the social determinants of health, public attitudes, stigma. Stigma is really an issue. Resources, finances, integration of care. Many minorities are particularly disadvantaged, like those with intellectual disabilities. The importance of family, of chronic disease management, and the ethical dilemmas, particularly with end-of-life care. The most rewarding aspect of my career has been working with community groups such as Dementia Australia and Alzheimer's Disease International to enhance policy, deliver better services, improve quality of life for people with dementia and their families, enhance research, and help with developing services for low and middle income countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Henry. We now have another new fellow joining us by Zoom, Professor Tom Calma. Welcome, Tom.
Thank you. Right, thank you. And can I begin by acknowledging I'm on the land of the Ngunnawal people here in Canberra and recognise other Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people online in the countries you come from. I'm a social work and community development graduate from the late 70s, and that has really formed the foundations and the fundamentals of what I do. Listening, compassion, empathy, empowerment, problem solving, and more recently, the labels of determinants, both social and cultural determinants, and addressing unconscious bias. They're all the fundamentals that I practice almost daily. I've had a 38-year career in the public service and worked both in mainstream and Indigenous services. Been a diplomat, Australian diplomat in India and Vietnam, social justice and race discrimination commissioner at the Australian Human Rights Commission, and also an academic and researcher. So I wanted to just touch on a couple of broad issues that I've been involved with that might give you a bit of an appreciation of who I am. In 2006, as the Social Justice Commissioner, I launched a report that addressed that proposed an address from a human rights framework to the inequality in health outcomes for Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. We were dying 17 years younger than the rest of the population. So I proposed that we look at it from a human rights perspective, which was really about centering people most affected, making sure that governments were accountable, making sure funding was based on need. And fortunately, that program is still going. We know the government's response is called the Closing the Gap. We've now got a national agreement. We've now got Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people determining the priorities and targets. So it's been an ongoing program, but it also addresses all those issues that I mentioned earlier. Justice reinvestment, another important one, that we've seen the government now funding trials across the nation to try and keep Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people out of prison when they don't need to be incarcerated. And finally, with a fellow of 2001, Professor Marcia Langton, we did work on co-designing the Voice to Parliament exercise, and we're now members of the working group for the referendum. And so we're working to try and educate the rest of the community on why it's so important to sign off positively when the referendum is called in another 12 to 18 months' time. So they are who I am and the key issues that I work on. There's many more too that I get involved with, but I think that'll give you a flavour. So remember, when the referendum comes up, vote yes. Thank you.
Thank you, Tom, and a great note to end on. I'd now like to welcome Professor Michele Ford, who's also joining us virtually.
Thanks. I'm an area studies scholar of Southeast Asia who draws mostly on the disciplines of geography, sociology, and political science. For me, these disciplines operate as a toolbox that I use to address particular puzzles or problems that I observe in my research domain. I'm a woman of many enthusiasms, but writ large, my research domain centres on social movements, always with some connection to Southeast Asia. I spend a lot of my time thinking about the intersection between global and local unions. I'm interested in questions of how flows of ideas, money, and influence help or hinder unions that are struggling against authoritarian regimes or rebuilding after some big political upheaval. I'm currently exploring these questions in relation to Cambodia, Indonesia, Myanmar, and Timor-Leste. The case I know best is Indonesia, but a comparative lens helps me to understand how the international processes at work and how the contingency inherent in politically volatile societies and in the global union's own lean organisational structures affect the outcomes in different national contexts. My research is a lot about structures, but it's also about the individuals who inhabit them and who work to change them. In Indonesia, unions punched way above their weight after the fall of Suharto in 1998. There was a lot of hope after Myanmar opened up in 2011, but as many of you would know, unionists are now struggling to find a way forward after the 2021 coup. Things are also hard in Cambodia. Just today, the head of a union representing casino workers that has been on strike for almost a year was arrested upon her return from an event in Melbourne. Another aspect of my research that I'm really excited about relates to the role of the internet in both work and social activism. I've done some research on the gig economy in Indonesia, looking at workers' spontaneous protests and other forms of collective action, targeting the region's big digital platforms. An interesting element of this story is the failure of Uber and other global platforms to crowd out the regional platforms like Gojek and Grab. But more importantly for me, though, is the vibrancy of these protests and the role that platform work is playing in formalising previously informal occupations. I've also looked at various kinds of other activist campaigns. A particularly fun one was called Panties for Peace. This was a very early hybrid campaign dating back to 2007, when pro-democracy activists jumped online to ask women around the world to send their panties to the Burmese junta. The campaign went viral and Myanmar embassies around the world were flooded with panties. Besides its novelty value, which I must admit did have some attraction for me, the campaign was really interesting in theoretical terms because it leveraged a local superstition about the ability of women's underwear to undermine men's power to mount a global campaign. In my latest project, I'm bringing these interests together to dig into how the international labour movement uses different social media platforms to raise awareness of different labour struggles. As in the case of all the work I do, I hope that this research will have real-world impact as well as academic.
Thank you, Michele, and congratulations to you too. We now welcome Professor Bronwyn Fredericks.
Hi everyone, Bronwyn Fredericks. I'm a Guri woman from southeast Queensland, and I acknowledge the Yagara country in which I'm zooming in from this evening, which is, people might know it as southeast Queensland or southeast Brisbane. My research over my career to date has mostly focused with community-based or collaborative research with Indigenous people and Indigenous organisation, where I've worked to not just work collaboratively, but work to build and support Indigenous organisations and communities, and in terms of addressing social and economic and broader systemic and structural inequalities. I've undertaken both qualitative and quantitative and mixed methods research. However, most people would probably think me as a qualitative researcher, and it's where I probably sit in terms of favouring, although I do a mixture of work. I love to lead research, but I also love to work collaboratively on other people's projects where they lead. So I'm quite happy to do a range of things. Mostly I undertake work that is of great interest to me and also that community has prioritised as an area of need. I'm a graduate of both health and education disciplines, but I have worked across education and health, more specifically public health, social sciences, politics, and I think it's probably sometimes why it's been hard for people to categorise where my work most comfortably sits. I prefer to talk about critical Indigenous studies and the work that then I do looking outwardly back towards disciplines or through disciplines through the lens of critical Indigenous studies. Some of my recent work has been with the Queensland Productivity Commission, and some of that work is available on web links. You can find that in terms of the reports. I've also been undertaking some COVID in real-time work located in a place-based platform through Southeast Queensland, along with South Coast New South Wales. The work in South Coast New South Wales has also been working with those communities that were also bushfire impacted. So both COVID and bushfires and communities, how they're responding to that in real time, along with the Southeast Queensland, in terms of how communities here in Southeast Queensland have been responding to supporting themselves in terms of COVID. In addition, I'm currently working on an NHMRC project that's looking at evaluation and co-design with community-based health services, education, and the last one is the Centre of Excellence funded by the ARC is some of my new work, and we just had a meeting, our first big international meeting about that last week, and that's what I'm really excited for going forward. And just following up on Tom, I will be going forward with some work in the constitutional space and supporting groups around treaty as well. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, Bronwyn. I think we're all left amazed at how you fit all that into 24 hours in one day, and we'd all love to learn the secret. We now move to our last presentation in this bracket. This is a pre-recorded presentation from Professor Cheryl Dissanayake.
Hello, I'm Professor Cheryl Dissanayake, and I'm truly honoured to be elected as Fellow into this prestigious society, and I hope to serve you well. I am the founder and inaugural director and chair of the Olga Tennyson Autism Research Centre at La Trobe University, which is the first autism research centre in Australia. It was made possible by a donation from a remarkable philanthropist, Mrs. Olga Tennyson, who not only continued to support our work until her passing in 2021, but has left us an extraordinary bequest. So I would sincerely like to acknowledge Olga, as without her and the platform for autism research that she has enabled, I wouldn't be presenting to you today. She has allowed me to achieve much more than I thought possible in the field of autism, including co-founding the Australasian Society for Autism Research, whose conference I am at today, which is why I am not with you in person. She has also enabled me to build capacity in others to undertake much needed research in the field, so that we now have a thriving research centre, and our autism research is funded in perpetuity as a result of her phenomenal bequest. I'm a developmental psychologist and a behavioural scientist, with my key research interests being in the area of early development, particularly how autistic babies grow and develop. My work has contributed to our ability to identify autism within the very early years of life, which is so important so that children can receive the supports they need to help them learn. Thus, I also undertake studies on how best to foster early learning. To enable all this, I co-established the Early Assessment Clinic for Autism, focused on children under 3 years of age, and also the Margot Prior Early Autism Centre. Autism is no longer rare, with approximately 2 to 3% of the population receiving a diagnosis. Our world is not purpose-built for autistic or neurodivergent people, and much disability ensues as a result. And we need to work together to minimize this experience of disablement. Nothing, of course, is achieved alone, and I'm indebted to my collaborators, many of who began as my students. I now even have autistic students, which I could never have imagined when I started in the field in 1984. And I certainly stand to learn a lot from them. I'd like to acknowledge my gratitude to La Trobe University for always saying yes when I asked. La Trobe matched Olga's first 2 donations and has supported our centre to thrive. It is now the leading institution in autism research in Australasia. And together we still have a lot of work to do. And this recognition as fellow is empowering and I know will aid me in this work. So thank you.
Well, I think we've had a great taste of why these people have been elected to the fellowship. What a wonderful sense of the breadth and depth of work that we've seen so far. We're now going to break for 30 minutes or maybe just a little less to keep things moving. Please enjoy some more drinks. There's more canapés coming, and enjoy talking to the new fellows who've presented to you. Thanks, everyone. Thank you. Ladies and gentlemen, fellows, can I ask you to come back, please? Thank you. Please bring drinks, bring more food. There's an awful lot there. One of the demands of having people waiting online for presentations is we have to be a bit more careful about the timing. Thank you very much. Please come and take your seats. We're going to move on with the presentations now. Okay.
I knew that I wasn't living right. Lie awake for over half the night. I know that I was aiming
so she's not here, so I shouldn't introduce her. I'll go straight into her.
Is anybody really satisfied? I don't care.
I'm going to go now because she's the first one on the list. It says in-person presentation. Okay. Shall I check? Can I just check? Is Michele? She's online. Okay. So sorry. I'd now like to welcome and congratulate Professor Michele Foster, who's joining us online.
Thank you so much, Jane. Just imagine that the country in which you were born, the country in which your family has lived for generations, does not recognise you as a citizen. And imagine that this is because you are of a certain ethnicity or race or gender. Imagine that this means that you cannot go to school or access adequate health care or live a decent, dignified life. This is called being stateless and is a condition that afflicts at least 15 million people across the globe as we speak. Stateless people are some of the most vulnerable on earth and are found in every country in the world. The UN High Commissioner for Refugees estimates that a child is born into statelessness every 10 minutes. It's estimated that 40% of the world's stateless population lives in the Asia-Pacific region, meaning this issue is particularly salient for us in Australia. One must only consider the plight of the Rohingya to understand that statelessness can lead to the most fundamental violation of human rights in its most extreme form, genocide. Now, stateless people reside in Australia, but because we've not implemented our international obligations to protect them, many stateless people are in immigration detention where they may remain for their whole life. This is a pressing human rights issue of the highest order. but does not receive the attention it deserves. I'm Michele Foster, and I'm the director of the Peter McMullen Centre on Statelessness at Melbourne Law School. My research, as well as that of the research team that I lead, is aimed at understanding the causes and consequences of statelessness and developing legal and public policy responses aimed at the prevention of statelessness and the protection of stateless persons. My most recent monograph explores the history and current relationship between refugee law and the protection of stateless persons, drawing on my expertise as an international refugee law scholar. My current ARC-funded project is exploring statelessness in Australian law and practice and involves doctrinal legal research as well as identifying and interviewing persons with lived experience of statelessness. The aim of the project is to develop a blueprint for enhancing the protection of stateless persons in this country, as well as a template for researching statelessness that could be applied in the wider region. I supervise PhD students who are undertaking research on statelessness in Nepal, India, Japan, and Syria, as well as a range of innovative theoretical and legal topics within statelessness studies. I'm the founder and co-editor-in-chief of the only specialised journal in the field, the Statelessness and Citizenship Review. Through such initiatives, I support the development of the emerging interdisciplinary field of statelessness studies. I'm honoured to have been elected to the Academy, and I hope that it will further amplify the reach and potential impact of my research. Thank you so much.
I'd now like to welcome Professor Lisa Gibbon to the stage.
Good evening. Where were you 20 years ago? That's what I started thinking about in preparing for tonight, thinking, where have I come from? What has happened to me in the last 20 or more years? At that time, I was an assistant professor at University of Alberta in Canada. I was working in my first job, thinking about what I was going to do with my life. How was I going to be this brand new information scientist? I'm an interdisciplinary scholar. I work across a lot of different fields. I've worked with people in medicine, computing science, digital humanities, history, philosophy, you name it, I've probably partnered with them. But where did it start? Where did it begin? 20 or so years ago, I was standing in Sarajevo on a post-war recovery project, looking at bullet holes on the sidewalk and thinking, I can't believe that my work can make a difference in the world. I was there helping judges and mayors to actually think about the role of technology in post-war recovery. Flash forward a few months later, I was sitting in a circle of people in Canada, thinking about the Métis Nation, thinking about how my work in digital technologies could actually help them to gather the evidence they needed to put forward land claims. Flash forward a few more months, I was sitting in Ottawa. I'd volunteered to serve on the Social Sciences and Humanities Working Committee, trying to actually make a better ethics document that would actually meet the needs of social science scholars across the country. And I kind of laugh at that one because it was a one-year committee agreement that I made, and I ended up serving on that committee for 9 years. Story of our lives. But looking back, all of those early experiences, those formative years were absolutely critical. I learned that research can affect change, that people, human beings, have to be centered in our approaches to technology, and that qualitative research is really critical to moving social change and moving people's experiences forward. And the mentoring that I received as a PhD student, as an early career researcher, was absolutely critical, and I pay that forward in all the work that I do. Yet even then, the social sciences to me were constantly under threat. And I find that we continue to have to fight now for research funding globally. We see this even now as we move towards thinking about an engagement agenda, an impact agenda. We continue to fight. I look at the rhetoric around commercialization and other strategies, and the positioning of STEM, and I think, Where do we fit into this narrative? We can't be complacent. I was extremely fortunate to be funded by the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council in Canada in the early years, and later the ARC after I'd moved here to Australia. But in those early days, I could really see the tide turning, then and now. This prompted an entire thread of my work that became very interdisciplinary and really is core to the work that I do today. Because of the lack of funding in social sciences and humanities, I turned to the Canadian Institutes for Health Research. I partnered with colleagues in the health areas to bring a social sciences, a human dimension to that work, which was innovative and new. They didn't know what to do with me at times. To explore social media use for mental health, to look at how we could reduce tobacco use among Indigenous teens, to explore vaccine decision-making among women pregnant. I was part of a network of Center of Excellence project that did research in over 35 hospitals across the country, looking at how families and young children experience the trauma of going to an emergency room. I've also worked with humanities scholars, looking at the different tools that they use in their work. I've worked with what we call the hard sciences, hate that term, in agriculture and wine science and other disciplines, to look at what the soft sciences, also hate that term, what we can bring to better understanding that kind of work in the world. All of these through a social sciences lens. Throughout this work, I also maintained a long thread in terms of methodology, how we can bring a qualitative perspective of mixed methods practice forward to inform the work that we do. And I think that's critical now as we move into a societal impact agenda. Some of my most highly cited and innovative works have actually been in qualitative research. But I also literally wrote the book on how people look for information. The new 5th edition has just gone to the publisher last week, thank God. But I'm most proud of the spaces where I've actually had an impact and I've seen my research in action. These include the move in Canada towards land claims for Métis Nation. I've given testimony at the federal court around the credibility of online sources, and I know that my work has influenced a number of working professionals in their day-to-day life as they try to bring a research lens to their own practice. Social sciences are critical to social change, and I'm very proud to be part of this community where we're all focused on ensuring that social change is made possible. Thank you.
Thank you and welcome to the Academy. Professor Guyonne Kalb is our next presenter. Congratulations, Guyonne.
Thank you, Jane, and good evening, everyone, and thank you very much for coming along to this event this evening. So I'm a fellow at the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research here at the University of Melbourne on the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation. And I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the lands on which we meet and pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging. My main area of research is in labor economics, but I have branched out to the areas of education, health and household economics, as these are all intrinsically linked when you're interested in understanding the female labor force participation, work-family balance, intra-family sharing of care and paid work, and how these drive economic outcomes for women. And as a chief investigator in the ARC Center of Excellence for Children and Families over the Life course, I have been fortunate to collaborate with researchers from other disciplines on questions in this area. And this has really enriched my understanding of these topics and allowed me to look at these topics from different angles. So in my research, I focus on understanding how disadvantage can arise and what can be done to prevent it from occurring and or being transmitted to the next generation. The role of social policy is of particular interest to me, and I use a range of different types of data sources to learn about what works and doesn't work in policy. And I would like to advance our understanding of how people make decisions and what the implication of these decisions are, not just short-term, but also longer-term. And my aim in most of my research is to try and find useful answers to current policy questions. And ideally, my research can ultimately also be published in a refereed academic journal, but the research always starts from a policy question. And I feel that I've been fortunate to work on several really interesting questions during my career. And in the remaining time, I would like to mention a few topics that I've worked on and that I'm working on at the moment. Because I do hope to connect with others in the academy around topics of common interest, and so I hope to find common interests with several of the other fellows. And so one of the highlights of my career has been my involvement in the evaluation of the universal paid parental leave when this was introduced in 2011. And together with colleagues, we assessed the impact of this policy on maternity leave duration, on the probability and timing of returning to employment, and how impacts varied across different groups of women. So we found that this really had a quite major impact, particularly for women of lower wages. A very recent project investigated the impact of divorce on men and women's probability of being in poverty and the role of pre-divorce employment in this. And the large jump in poverty amongst divorced women highlights the importance of more equal sharing of caring roles and paid employment between men and women for more equitable outcomes. So I hope to continue working on these topics and related topics over the remaining 10 years or so of my career and contribute to generating useful evidence for policymakers. Thank you.
Thank you, and congratulations on your election. We now have a remote presentation, so please welcome Evelyn Go joining us by Zoom.
I am a scholar primarily of international relations and international security, and I specialize in strategy and security in the region that we broadly know as East Asia or the Asia Pacific. My work as a scholar is distinguished by a very deliberate treatment of East Asia as subject rather than as object. By this, I mean that I try in everything I do to understand the region, its motivations, its dynamics, its peculiarities, and its commonalities on its own terms rather than via pre-existing assumptions or theories derived from historical and geographical experiences elsewhere. In my work as well, have consistently tried to forge across and to bridge apparent dichotomies in many of the frameworks that we bring to bear in thinking about international relations or security. For example, I bridge the gaps between empirics and theory, the gap between economics and security, the gaps between the regional and the global, and also the distances between the past, the present, and the future. In terms of research subjects, I am a specialist in thorny relationships like the US-China relationship, the China-Japan relationship, both of these sets of relationships in the contemporary context as well as in the historical context. I have, through my original research in these areas, contributed in turn to re-theorizing or to refining concepts that are foundational to my fields. These include the shifting of our emphasis away from understanding power distribution or power differentials between great powers towards a much more useful understanding of international order and how transitions in order shape the circumstances and circumscribe the choices of all states, not just great powers. I have also done work on looking at how great powers exercise influence over others as opposed to simply wielding power to bring about outcomes. I'm known also for my work on excavating and explaining Southeast Asian strategies towards great powers, which for a long time defied existing conventional theorizing. Two areas in which I'm most excited to contribute to Australian social sciences are, one, my training of PhD students in the kind of work that equally emphasizes conceptual and theoretical innovation as well as empirical rigor. And secondly, the ongoing work that I've been doing with different parts of the Australian Public Service in terms of outreach and engagement, bringing to bear research-based results and outputs in co-creation with policy communities to improve strategic literacy, as well as to heighten the efficacy of strategic policy making, processes, and outcomes.
And thank you for contending with the technical glitch. We now go to Professor Sharynne McLeod, and this is a pre-recorded presentation.
Hello, my name is Professor Sharynne McLeod from Charles Sturt University in Bathurst, rural New South Wales. I'm so honoured to become a Fellow of the Academy of the Social Sciences of Australia. What a huge honour. My area of interest is talking. I love talking. And quite frankly, I think in order to become a Fellow, most of us love talking. However, I am really passionate about communication as a human right. The right for us all, every single person on this planet, to have the capacity to communicate, to receive and to impart knowledge and needs, wants, and just stuff to one another, like the Universal Declaration of Human Rights has in Article 19. In fact, in 2019, I represented the Australian Government and Speech Pathology Australia and the International Communication Project at the United Nations to advocate for communication as a human right. Where I come from is that I love to advocate for children's rights to communicate. I also love to advocate for multilingual people's rights to communicate, particularly those who speak languages and dialects that are not mainstream and not dominant languages in different countries. The work that I do is with over people who speak or work in over 70 different languages at the moment, and the Multilingual Children's Speech website has resources that are available for people across the world to access in those different languages. I am a speech pathologist and have worked in early childhood education for the last 20 years. So I am passionate about interdisciplinary work, but particularly for multilingual children with speech sound disorders. That means children who are often unintelligible. I think they are one of the most marginalised groups in our world, one of the groups that very few people actually listen to, particularly not policymakers. So I am a great advocate for support, encouragement, so that these kids can live with joy, love being in the playground rather than being scared and watching out the library window of other kids playing because nobody understands them. We hear some terrible stories, and in fact an Australian Government Senate inquiry showed these terrible stories. I'm really passionate about supporting these children, and I'm also passionate about the fact that we have very long waiting lists for speech pathology. So I'm honoured to receive this fellowship and look forward to using it as a way to continue my advocacy for communication as a human right.
And perfectly timed too. We now move to another pre-recorded presentation from Professor Francesca Merlan.
Hello, this is Francesca Merlan. In my research and writing as an anthropologist, I've had a long-standing interest in the dynamics of social and cultural change, with a special reference to interaction over the long term between Indigenous Australians and European and other arrivals to the continent. In 2018, I published a book the title of which is Dynamics of Difference in Australia, Indigenous Past and Present in a Settler Country. In that book, I attempted to present in greater detail than had been previously done the variety of dynamics of interaction in encounters of different sorts between Indigenous people and colonizers, in order to illustrate and analyze both the diversity of those encounters, but also the inexorability of conditions and power differentials between the parties. It seems to me to always have been and to remain a question how to understand the relation between persisting possibilities of diverse and alternative outcomes and that inexorability. And that seems to remain an important issue today. To name another aspect of my research in Northern Australia, in the region where I went for the first time in 1976 in the area of Katherine, a diversity of Indigenous languages were spoken, many of which have since diminished radically in speakership and or are no longer spoken. While I've always taken language documentation to be an important part of my research in the region, some of the space of alternative possibility that I referred to before is now in relation to community, cultural, territorial, and language maintenance and revival, activities that support those things, and especially Indigenous peoples' views of and engagement in them. Having always in mind that tension between inexorability of overwhelming change and the possibilities of alternative outcomes, I have for many years of my career participated in land rights and native title cases, and I continue to do that now more than ever since I retired in July 2021, partly in order to be able to travel more freely and participate in those kinds of activities, including in new areas, in areas of the country new to me, such as Eastern Arnhem Land. In relation to my long years of involvement in language documentation, I recently received an Endangered Languages Documentation Project grant to continue work on a northern language called Wardaman, speakers and descendants of which are now having to deal with demands concerning conservation and maintenance in their homelands, fracking and other kinds of developments, and questions around community identity and coherence in relation to all of those different matters. Specifically in relation to language, I'm working with 2 remaining speakers of Wardaman on an encyclopedic dictionary of their language, using both some of the material I earlier collected and other material recently collected. I've also been involved in long-term research with my husband, Alan Rumsey, in the highlands of Papua New Guinea. Over the years, we've looked at the dynamics of interactions among groups there whose relations to each other and to the PNG state system are volatile, and who continue in many ways to live their lives on their own terms, but with interested consciousness concerning the wider world and what they see as desirable development. Underpinning their relative autonomy are their processes of socialization of children, and we are engaged in a large comparative project on child socialization, language learning, and multimodal learning. This year, as I said before, I'm not able to attend the November meeting since I'm in Colombia with my grandchildren, but I look forward to future events during the year. Thank you very much. Bye.
And now our final pre-recorded session. Welcome to Professor Russell Smyth.
I'm Russell Smyth. I'm an applied economist who works on energy. One of the issues that I'm currently most interested in is understanding the causes and antecedents of energy poverty. Energy poverty is a particular form of poverty that is due to a combination of high energy costs, low income, and usually inefficient buildings and appliances that use energy. A lot of the initial work on energy poverty was done in the UK, and there it was associated with inability to heat the home, particularly in the UK winters. But energy poverty is clearly not just a cold winter phenomenon. In Australia, for instance, conservative estimate is that 1 in 4 people live in energy poverty. It's particularly topical at the moment with the recent federal budget projecting that average energy costs will increase 50% over the next year. My work together with others has tried to delve into the behavioural and the socio-economic reasons for energy poverty. So we've done work focusing on factors such as the role of crime, ethnicity, problem gambling, religion and personality traits like locus of control. And together with colleagues, we've also looked at the implications of energy poverty for things like health, including mental health, subjective well-being and mortality. And a line of research is focused on the relationship between energy poverty and food security, particularly for older Australians. Thank you for the opportunity to introduce my work on energy poverty and to be a part of the Academy. It is certainly a great honour.
Right. We're now going to continue with inviting in some new fellows to make virtual presentations. And our next presenter, welcome to Professor Hans Pols, and congratulations, Hans, on your election.
Thank you very much. I'm speaking from Wango country, which is also known as the Balmain Peninsula. First, a big thank you to the Academy of the Social Sciences in Australia. Thank you for inviting me to become a fellow. About me, I grew up next to a mental hospital in the Netherlands. As a kid, I played in the woods around that mental hospital with my friends. We often bumped into patients. No, they were not scary. They were actually quite friendly. My father worked at that mental hospital. My auntie was a psychoanalyst, an orthodox one. When she visited, there was no peace in the house. At all. Ever. My mother was born in Batavia, in the Dutch East Indies. So fortunately, as a kid, I never really had to eat standard Dutch fare, which was wonderful. She arrived in the Netherlands for the first time in 1946 when she was 8. And what about the Dutch East Indies? Well, there is a thing we call in the Netherlands the Great Indies Silence, not a word ever. Did all of this spark my interest in psychiatry, mental health, mental disorder, and mental illness? It probably did. Most research in the history of psychiatry is about mental hospitals and asylums. I do not know why, but I was always much more interested in mental health outside large institutions. I studied the history of the mental hygiene movement at the University of Pennsylvania, using very traditional methods, literature studies, archival research, writing it up. Quite interesting. When I finished, I became really interested in the history of colonial psychiatry in the Dutch East Indies. Colonial medicine and its history was all the rage, but nobody really had looked at colonial psychiatry in the Dutch East Indies. That could, of course, be a language issue. Then in 2001, I ended up at the University of Sydney, and finally it was feasible to visit Indonesia. This led to all kinds of interesting and unsuspected changes in how I approached my research. I met a former student of my father, who had met as a kid. He had been director of the large mental hospital just outside of Jakarta. So he showed me around, introduced me to other people. What a great start. I met several physicians, Indonesian physicians, interested in the history of medicine in their country. And they told me there was something really special about Indonesian physicians in colonial times. They were all politically engaged, many of them. They participated in the Indonesian nationalist movement. Wow, that's interesting. So I started to investigate that. I interviewed some very old physicians, some of them who had started their medical studies in Dutch East Indies times, and they had that very same accent speaking Dutch that my grandmother and her sisters had, 5 sisters, when they met and started to think about and talk about the past. Well, the result is a book, Nurturing Indonesia. And I argue in that book that medicine, it could be a tool of empire. Yes, been there, done that. But there are many connections between medicine and decolonization as well. I became very much interested in mental health in Indonesia today. And I interviewed psychologists, psychiatrists, mental health nurses, social workers, and patients and patient groups. I started to participate in debates in Indonesia. It is time to decolonize mental health in Indonesia. Well, yes, of course, but what does it mean? Well,
Thank you, Hans. I'm afraid that we need to move on to the next presentation.
Sorry about that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. I know that we could talk about your work as we could with many others, and one of the frustrations of these short presentations is the lack of opportunity to explore, but believe me, as part of the fellowship, there'll be many more conversations. I'd now like to welcome Deborah Street to the presentation this evening and to the Academy. Thanks, Debbie.
Thanks, Jane. Hello, everyone. I'm delighted to join the Academy and welcome this opportunity to introduce my work. I have focused on the theory of the construction of designs for discrete choice experiments used in the measurement of stated preferences. Much of my applied work has been in the area of health economics, where the methods I have developed are used to inform health policy and programs when revealed preference data are not sufficient, not suitable, or not available. The discrete choice experiment consists of 3 components, which I will illustrate with a recent example from my work. The first is the context in which you are making the decision, such as imagine that there is 1 bed left in the intensive care unit, but 2 patients arrive who need that bed. The second is the question, here, which patient would you admit? And finally, there is a description of the 2 patients, which includes information that is relevant to making the decision, such as age, health status before becoming ill, likelihood of surviving if admitted to ICU, occupation, and caring responsibilities. Not all possible pairs of patients can be included in the experiment, since there are far too many. So it is critical to choose a suitable set of pairs of patients to show to respondents. These pairs form the design for the discrete choice experiment. By asking enough people to independently make such choices, we can understand community views about priorities for limited ICU beds. In this work, we were then able to compare that with the recommendations of the relevant professional body. The same general approach can be applied widely to inform policy and practice. I have been involved in projects to understand how the community values different health outcomes, which can be directly applied in answering resource allocation questions in the health system. Other recent examples from my work include projects to estimate the impact that making HIV self-testing kits available would have on testing rates, to estimate preferences around genetic screening for cancer, and to consider how parents, healthcare providers, and the community weigh variables of care and cost for expensive treatments for the degenerative neuromuscular disorder, spinal muscular atrophy. My current projects include investigating community preferences for end-of-life care, the development of pediatric quality of life measures, and the development of an instrument that considers both health and social care when assessing quality of life. Given the competing demands for scarce healthcare resources, discrete choice experiments play an important role in informing resource allocation. Thank you for your attention.
Thanks, Debbie, and congratulations on your election. That brings to an end the pre-recorded and Zoom presentations, and I'm pleased that we're now moving back to some people who are really here, and I'm pleased to welcome Professor Harald van Hert.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Harald van Heerde, Research Professor of Marketing at UNSW, located on medical land. In my research, I try to find out what type of marketing works versus doesn't work, using big data and econometric models. This way, firms can become more productive, avoid wasteful spending, and consumers can get the products that make their lives better. One question I've looked into is, if a brand enters a market, is a new brand, what's the best way to grow that brand? You might think advertising might be an effective way of gaining sales, but actually my research shows that advertising, especially traditional advertising on TV and in newspapers, is very ineffective and mostly a waste of money. You might think temporary price reductions are a good way to attract customers, and of course they work well in the short run. A lot of people like discounts, but in the long run actually they backfire because you train people to only buy on special and don't buy for the regular price. Instead, my research has shown that distribution, meaning bringing the products to the shops where people do their shopping, is one of the most effective ways of growing a brand. And also new product development is really important, especially for existing brands, in order to cater to the variety of tastes that consumers have. Recently, I finished a study where we looked at in which countries is marketing more effective compared to other countries. And interestingly, we found that countries that are characterized by strong social stratification are the countries where marketing is most effective. So, for example, countries with higher power distance or stronger income inequality, people there are more sensitive to marketing messages than in countries where those aspects are less. So, for example, in China, Malaysia, Philippines, marketing is much more effective than in a more equal society such as Australia. In general, in much of my research, I try to let the data speak. I'm trying to document what kind of marketing works, in which case, inspired by new developments such as social media or the ups and downs in the business cycle. In my work, I do not necessarily test theory, and I would call my research empirics first. However, a big part of the field of marketing is characterized by a theory-first approach. I've recently completed a 4-year term as an editor of the Journal of Marketing, and many of the papers, actually most of the papers that I handled, had this very linear template of having a conceptual framework, hypotheses, collection of data, and then most of the times all hypotheses are confirmed. I advocate for a greater role for empirics-first research, which is research that starts with a real-world observation, a data set, and doesn't necessarily try to test or develop new theory. The problem with this empirics-first research, it doesn't have a real template that theory-first research has, and as a result it has an uphill battle in the review process. In recent work, I've developed a guideline how to conduct, report, and evaluate empirics-first research, and I hope that will revolutionize my field of marketing and perhaps some of the other areas of social science as well. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you and welcome to the Academy. Our next in-person presentation is from Professor Janet McColl-Kennedy. Welcome, Janet.
Thank you very much, Jane, and thank you very much all who are involved. It is a delight to be here tonight and to receive the award of Fellow of this Learned Academy. I am also a professor in marketing, but I'm internationally known in the service science area. You might like to think about my work as understanding customers, whether they're guests, whether they're patients, whether they're consumers in a department store or in another service. So I have a number of projects. It was very hard to make a decision on which to showcase tonight. I am delighted that I've had now about 20 years of the Australian Research Council funding my research. So I'm just going to pull out a couple of examples. The first one on customer value co-creation. What does that mean? It's benefit realised from the integration of resources through activities and interactions in the customer's own service network. And we've got a number of papers in this stream of research, and the first empirical study of this in 2012, and in the top 1% of cited papers in that particular field. So we provide a theoretical framework, but then based on practice theory, but then take a number of takeaways out of this. So I'll mention some of those practical implications of this work. I'm very happy to say that it's being used not just in marketing and management, but also in medicine, engineering and healthcare services. What we identified were 5 different styles, the way that patients in this case, in this context, undertook value co-creation. And they were linked to, in a varying way, to perceived quality of life. So one of them is team management, and this was very interesting, that patients in the context of cancer, an important chronic disease, some of these patients assembled and managed their team to the extent that they hired and fired their primary healthcare team, which was really quite amazing. That had the highest, the link to highest quality of life. Partnering was another one, but it was primarily with the doctors. Pragmatic adapting was to try and adapt to the new normal that these people found themselves in. Insular controlling style was very much controlling from a distance, not very much interaction with people, not just within the medical area but outside, and so really kept very much to themselves, and that had relatively low quality of life. And the final one, passive compliance, the lowest quality of life totally. I didn't get to my second area, but I hope that's given you a little bit.
Thanks, Janet, and congratulations. I'm sure there'll be many more opportunities within the Academy to hear more about your fascinating work. I'm now calling on Professor Roger Wilkins. Roger, welcome and congratulations.
Thank you, Jane, and very honoured to be elected to the Academy. Now, on the program, I'm listed last. Is that correct?
No, we've got one more.
Oh, we've got one. All right, we're getting close to the end. You nearly made it. Well done, Sascha, to get this far. I'm an applied microeconomist, and like Guyonne Kalb, I work in the Melbourne Institute of Applied Economic and Social Research here at the University of Melbourne. While my research has spanned a number of topics, I'd have to say that I've probably got 2 passions above all others. The first can be broadly described as the study of the distribution of economic well-being. This includes simply describing income and wealth distributions and their dynamics, as well as research investigating the extent, nature, drivers and the consequences of socioeconomic disadvantage and advantage. Probably the main motivation for my work is in this space is a belief that how the benefits of economic output are distributed matters almost as much as the total quantity of output. I think it's also self-evident that good economic and social policy requires understanding the distribution of economic well-being and how this distribution is affected by policy. So I think that's probably what's driven me. And I think when I started out, I felt that economics, in particular at least, economics, as a discipline, didn't place enough emphasis on distributional matters. I'd say that that's probably less the case today than it was when I started, but certainly that was what got me working in that space. My second passion, and this is perhaps somewhat unusual, is a data set, and it's known as the HILDA survey, the Household Income and Labour Dynamics in Australia survey. So HILDA's Australia's, for those of you who don't know, Australia's household longitudinal study started in 2001 under the leadership of Mark Wooden, who is a fellow of the Academy and who is still leading it. I've been part of the team at the Melbourne Institute working on producing the data since 2007, and I've also been leading the production of the annual statistical report that we've been producing since around 2005. So my bold claim for the evening is that more than any other single data source, HILDA tells the story of the Australian community. It's not to downplay the importance and indeed necessity of the many other sources of economic and social data out there, including ABS surveys, the growing array of administrative sources and so on. But HILDA is uniquely rich, both by virtue of its gathering information on a wide variety of life domains, and also by virtue of it being longitudinal. So it really allows for a much more richer set of research questions to be explored and linkages to be explored than any other data sort. Now, we of course have challenges in keeping it as a critical piece of the Australian data landscape, but going forward, certainly my aspiration is that Hilda will continue for many years to come, and hopefully long after I'm gone. So, thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And now, the last but not least fellow for me to introduce is Professor Jacqueline Troy.
So I really should be sitting because I want to use my possum, but that's probably not going to work. So Naya Jackie, Naya Namajimitong. I'm Jackie. I'm the Professor Director for Indigenous Research at the University of Sydney. Most importantly, I am Ngarigu of the Snowy Mountains in southeastern Australia, and my clan group are Nyamich, so Nyamajimitong. My special quirk is that I write dictionaries and grammars. And many years ago, actually in my undergraduate years, I started working on the language of the Sydney area, and to my great joy, I was proven absolutely wrong. It's great to live through that, that the language of Sydney was extinct. That's what I said back in the 1980s and published in the 1990s. Sydney mob are speaking their language again, in some small part because they've used the research that I did, which as an Aboriginal person working with my community colleagues is a lovely feeling. This is where I kept going for the rest of my life. I found something recently when I was at the University of Sydney, aged 18, and I wrote that I was going to work on bringing our languages back into practice again, and I was going to look into the settler colonial histories of our peoples, and that's pretty much what I've done. I also now work in northwest Pakistan and helping mob there to get on with their languages and their musical and cultural life. So, my special quirk is I can make it snow, which will either make you love me or hate me, I don't care, but it does happen. And I have worked recently on reconstructing a song of my people, Song of the Women of the Manaroo. Traditionally, women drummed on possums like this. So I think actually I can do that. Don't creep up on me, Jane. I'm going to sing this and then I'm going. I'm out. I'm off. I'm gone. Right. So this is a song that I worked on with Linda Barwick, who's an ethnomusicologist from the University of Sydney. We've published about it. You can read Troy and Barwick. It's a brilliant paper. So, this is the snow song of my people. Picture yourself under the full moon, late March in 1834, John Lotsky, settler colonial, listening to the women of the Manaroo. Gunji gawal guyuri, gunji gawal guyuri, gumaji gugu, gawal gugumaji, gaba, that's the moon. Gumaji gugu, gumaji gugu, gawal gugumaji, gaba gumaji yuri. Gunji gawal guyuri, gunji gawal guyuri, gumaji gugu, gawal gugumaji, gaba gumaji gugu, gumaji gugu, gawal gugumaji, gaba gumaji yuri. Now, this song, in its original form, sounds like a parlour piece of music. When Linda and I cleaned it, of all that Europeanness, it came back to what sounds like a very typical southeastern Australian corroboree song. And I worked on the text that Lotsky provided, and it looks like snow, make it snow, bring the snow for us, by and by, bring the snow, send the snow. Moon, send the snow, the frosty moon, send the snow. So this is our connection with country, with the environment, our small contribution to reversing climate change. You can creep up on me now, it's all good. Thank you. And I'm so proud to be a member of the Academy. Thank you.
Thank you, Jackie, and we're very pleased to have you in the Academy, and how could I interrupt a performance like that? That was amazing. So that brings to an end our new Fellows presentations, but it doesn't bring to an end the ceremony for our new Fellows. Most of you will receive tomorrow night at the dinner your citations and your pins. But there are two people who will not be there tomorrow, and so Richard is rushing up to the stage, and we will make those presentations now. It's not very often that you can say of people that you're asked to introduce that these people need no introduction, but given what we've been through this evening, I think the two people who are coming to receive their citations really don't need any introduction. But still, I'm pleased to present to you Professor Kim Dovey, who is elected a Fellow for his research on the social impacts of urban design, planning and architecture. And also, I'm pleased to present to you Emeritus Professor Geoff Gallop, AC, for contributions as an academic, political leader and public intellectual, disseminating evidence-based social science. So, that's the end of the formal proceedings, but would you join me once more in congratulating all of those new Fellows and the wonderful work that they're doing, the breadth and depth of work that we've seen presented in such short snippets tonight. I think they'll certainly all enrich our Academy. I'd also like to thank those people who've been involved in organising this evening. Obviously, Chris and all the staff from the National Office who have unceasing energy and cheerfulness no matter what they face. But I think also a great thank you to our AV technician who has been patient, coped with all sorts of things. And this evening wouldn't have been possible without you being here, given the way that we tried to do it. So thank you very much. Now, as I close, I want to remind you that the symposium continues again tomorrow. Tomorrow it starts at 9 a.m. Please don't forget your name tags. You'll need them, I believe. But please come back. And remember that at 3:30 we have the annual Cunningham oration from Elizabeth Reed, a Fellow and, of course, a remarkable woman in the history of Australia and the development of women's issues. So, again, thank you for your patience. It feels like quite a long evening. It's been a long day, I know, but what a rich source of that our new Fellows bring to the Academy. So thank you all very much for your patience and attention.